and I want to welcome everyone to the Moving Forward with Clinical Trials Blood Cancers talk.
Thank you so much for being here today and giving us time to hear something about clinical trials. Before moving on to the blood cancer clinical trials and the lymphoma clinical trials, let me give you a brief overview of what clinical trials are.
Specialists, which some of you may be familiar with. These are folks, they are master's level nurses, social workers, or health librarians who can provide you with information and support as you go through whatever treatment, diagnosis, survivorship, any issues, questions, challenges that you might run into. And they are available 5 days a week, and their job is to answer the phone, answer emails, and be available to support patients and caregivers. Within that group, we do also have a clinical trial navigator. Her name is Peg, and she works with patients to help them find a clinical trial, enroll in a clinical trial. She helps to support with eligibility criteria to make sure that the clinical trial is a fit for you, and really supports throughout the entire process of a clinical trial. So if that's something that anyone is interested in, I do have some brochures, and I will leave them on the table for how you can connect with her and all of our other information specialists. And then the third program I wanted to mention is our First Connection program. This is a peer support program where newly diagnosed patients, caregivers, or people who are maybe about to start a new medication or maybe going to have a transplant, they can connect with a trained volunteer survivor who's been there and who can provide their unique perspective on, whatever things someone might be facing. So I do also have brochures for that, and if anyone's interested, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and I can get you connected with one of our many, many wonderful volunteers. We have some volunteers actually in this room who would like to support you in any way.
Animal testing, where they are looking if the treatment works in a living body and if there are side effects or not. But keep in mind, even though a new approach, it might work in lab or animals, but still it might not work in humans. So research is needed. Here comes the clinical trials. Clinical trials are divided into different phases. Each phase has a different purpose. It is answering a different question. So the first one, we start with the phase 1 trials. These are typically the first in human trials. These are done with a limited number of participants, usually 20 to 50 in number. So the researchers are looking what dosage is safe. How should the treatment be given? They are looking, is that the best route to give the treatment? How does treatment affect the body? They are collecting side effects. So as the participants, it's important people who are participating in the trial that they share what side effects they are experiencing. So that is the phase 1 trial. Moving on to the phase 2 trial, we are basically in the phase 2 trial, we are looking, is the medical treatment that we are testing, is it effective? Is it doing what it is supposed to do? How does this treatment affect the body? So those are the main questions. It is done in a relatively larger group of patients or participants, usually in the range of 100 to 500. Moving on to phase 3 trials. This is where we have some answers that the medication works, but we are still trying to confirm that. And this is and one way to make sure that it is effective is compare it with the standard of care treatment. This is done in a relatively larger participant population. It says 1,000, 5,000. It can be a little less, but it is in the range of thousands, or maybe for cancer clinical trials in the upper hundreds. So moving on from the phase 3 trial, we go to the phase 4 trial. By this time, usually the medication might be approved. And then phase 4 trial, some people call it observational trial, post-marketing trial, where we are collecting long-term safety and effectiveness data. So the journey of developing the cancer medication from phase 1 to phase 4, it's a long journey. It takes typically 8 to 10 years. However, with the new regulations at FDA, we have accelerated approvals possible especially for cancer clinical trials. In some of the trials, just like in the phase 3 trial, we might have comparison groups. What does comparison group mean? It basically means when patients enroll in a clinical trial, those patients will be assigned to 1, 2, or maybe more smaller group. Each group will have a different treatment assigned. And the purpose of these comparison groups is it allows the researchers to compare if one group outcome is better than the other. It also ensures that no patient is left untreated when they are especially on a cancer clinical trial. However, keep in mind for certain diseases when there is no standard of care identified, researchers might use a placebo group. What is a placebo? It is an inactive product that looks just like the study medication, but it doesn't work. Keep in mind that that is not kept a secret. Whenever placebos are used in any clinical trial, participants will be informed of the use of a placebo, and placebos are rarely used in cancer clinical trials. We usually use the standard of care arm versus the medication that is being tested. Moving on to the next slide. So how are people assigned to these comparison groups? We usually use a process which is called randomization. Usually it is done through the use of a computer which randomly assigns patients to one group versus the other. For example, a patient might be assigned to the standard treatment and placebo, and then the next patient might be assigned to the other group, standard treatment or a new treatment. Why are we doing this? Because especially this is usually combined with blinding, which we call where neither the physician nor the patient knows that they are being given the placebo, even though we tell them that there is a chance, equal likelihood of them getting the placebo versus the medication. This is done to prevent bias in research. And then bias results when in the test results occurs when it is affected by human choices or other factors that are not related to the study medication. So the purpose of the clinical trials is research. That means the clinical trials, they follow a strict scientific standards. These standards, they protect the patients as well as ensure that we have reliable study data available. Basically, the care for patients in clinical trial is a little different from what they would expect when they go to see their physician. This would mean perhaps it would be more tests, more medical visits. Basically, we are closely monitoring you to catch all those side effects and any unknown effects. But it's important to know that patients who participate in clinical trials, they do have rights, they have protection. These are important it's important to know that when you are taking part in a clinical trial, it is your right to understand that, to know what is involved in a clinical study. You should ask questions like, what is the study for? What are the risks? What are the benefits? What are other costs related with the clinical trials? If you are not comfortable knowing that you know the answers to all of this, ask the clinical team, the study team questions. If you decide you want to participate, even then you have the right to leave the study at any time. We call it voluntary participation. What it basically means is if you decide at any point, for whatever reason, you do not want to participate in the study any longer, it will not have a negative impact on your medical care at the institute or anywhere you're participating in the trial. Your participation is confidential. We do have standards and protections in place to make sure that your personal health information is maintained while you're on the trial. So moving on to the blood cancer trials, I want to share a trial that was done here at the Stanford Cancer Center, and it made a difference for the CLL trials, the chronic lymphocytic leukemia. Those are the trials I primarily work with. This was a study. It was a phase 2 open label study to test if ABT-199, it now has a name, venetoclax, was effective in patients with CLL who had relapsed or refractory. Let me, when I finish the presentation, let me know if you have any questions and if something is not clear. But this was done in CLL patients with 17p deletion. Basically, it's a more harder to treat form of CLL. It was sponsored by AbbVie. There were 31 sites worldwide. We at the Stanford Cancer Center, we were one of them. We enrolled approximately 7 patients. And then the purpose of this study was to see how effective the study drug worked. We opened, just to give you a timeline, we opened end of 2013. And based on the trial results, the venetoclax was approved in April 2016 by FDA for treatment in patients with CLL with this indication of 17p and have had 1 prior therapy. So that was an accelerated approval, or you can call a breakthrough approval for CLL patients. Going back, the next slide, going back a few more years, we had another trial that was done, sponsored by Pharmacyclics. This was for CLL patients as well. The medication was an oral pill, Ibrutinib. Some of you might be familiar with it. That trial, I think, opened end of 2010 at the Stanford Cancer Center, and it was approved for CLL treatment initially in 2014 for patients with CLL with at least 1 prior therapy. However, it was approved as a frontline, or you can use it for the first time in CLL patients in March 2016. So it is with the clinical trial participants that we were able to get this medication approved for everyone having CLL. That would be true for any other disease indication the study is working for. But these are some of the areas in hematology that we offer trials. I'll quickly go through that. So we have acute lymphoblastic leukemia trials, acute myeloid leukemia trials, and then chronic lymphocytic leukemia trials, and amyloidosis, multiple myeloma, myelodysplastic syndrome. There are various trials for that, and then myeloproliferative neoplasms.
Thanks. So I'm going to talk now more about lymphoma, which is similar to it's still a hematologic disorder, but it's more focalized to, more, I guess, localized to lymph nodes or to solid organs and skin in some cases. So I work with several investigators in the lymphoma group right now. There are 3 investigators that run in interventional clinical trials, and several others, including these 3, that run more observational studies. So there's probably over 30 trials right now open in lymphoma, which we can talk about later. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about Ibrutinib, which is the second drug and the second trial that Asma talked about. So Ibrutinib is also studied in lymphoma patients, in this case, mantle cell lymphoma. And I'm using this slide to kind of emphasize the fact that even though there's a drug that's already been approved, and I think this one was approved actually before for CLL, that an entire separate clinical trial has to be done for whatever other disease group that is being tested. So even though CLL and mantle cell lymphoma might not be that different, in fact, they had to conduct a whole separate trial for the mantle cell lymphoma. And so I have this picture up because this is the drug Ibrutinib, and this study was also run by the company Pharmacyclics, and the treatment is Ibrutinib, which is basically 4 pills a day, I believe. Mm-hmm. And the drug targets what's called Bruton tyrosine kinase, and this is the inside of the cell, and that's the outside of the cell. And right now I'm looking at mantle cell as a B-cell lymphoma. There's a whole cascade of signals that basically say, okay, I'm going to wake up the cell, and then I'm going to make the cell divide. So what this molecule does is it kind of sticks a key into this lock and turns off the signal, and that's how this whole Ibrutinib works. But in this study, so 111 patients were treated. The response was really great. 17% of the people had complete responses. About half the people had what's called a partial response, which is still pretty darn good. And the average response lasted for close to 18 months. And the results were published in June 2013, and the FDA approval for patients who have received at least 1 prior therapy for mantle cell patients was approved in November 2013. So it was pretty quick also. And the next slide, please. So that was a more recent drug, and I'm going to talk a little bit about a much older drug, which is still used pretty much in almost every B-cell lymphoma treatment. And it's back in 1997. It's a drug called rituximab. It's right now used in combination therapies and sometimes as a single agent to treat a lot of B-cell lymphoma cases. But I'm talking about it now because I think it's a great example of how a study goes from a very nascent phase 1 trial to being approved by the FDA. So in this study, basically they had this antibody molecule. So this was the first, rituximab was the first protein antibody to be approved for use in cancer treatments. And an antibody molecule is, we all have antibodies in our bodies. That's what fights, all the bacteria and things that we face. And in this case, the antibody was made against one of the little antenna molecules that's on the surface of B cells, and it's all B cells, mature B cells. And so this little molecule here that they made, that was synthesized in cells, now can target the outside of a B cell, including the lymphoma, and then that targets that cell to be killed. And so what they did for this study was to see if one dose of that antibody infused into patients, and they tried several different doses, could how safe it was, because it's a phase 1 study, and to see if there's any sign of how effective it might be. And in this very first study, we tried 5 different doses, 10 milligrams, 50, 100, 250, 500 milligrams on 15 patients. So three participants received doses, each dosing. And then the outcome was that tumor regressions occurred in 6 out of 15 patients after just one dose. That was pretty darn good. And the next slide, please. But, these clinical trials, in the long term, yes, everyone wants to see how it works, but especially in the early stages, what the scientists are looking for, what the clinical scientists are looking for is, what makes a drug work. So rather than they are in the long term interested in seeing that everyone, how well it can be used as a treatment. They're also looking to see, to gain more information about how the treatment might be working. And so in that first study with just the 15 patients, they showed that most of the symptoms, side effects, were pretty minor. It was fever, nausea, chills, hypertension, lowering of some blood counts, which the patients recovered from, and that in 3 months during the follow-up period, that there was not that many toxicities, like that people recovered well from the treatment. And they were looking to see whether it affected other parts of the immune system. You're tweaking the whole B cell population. Does it really mess other things up? And they showed that really it didn't really bother too many other aspects. They were looking to see how long the drug stayed around in the system, and really a good moderate level was persisted in 6 out of 9 patients for longer than 2 weeks. So that's really some information. They showed that the B cells, which were targeted by the antibody, were depleted out of the system in 24 to 72 hours and stayed depleted for 2 to 3 months. So that includes, the tumor bulk also. And then in vitro, in petri dishes, they showed that the antibody itself stopped the tumor cells from dividing and making more of itself. So these results that they were able to get from those first 15 patients were able to, were used to design the next set of studies. So on the next slide is now a study that was now set up in 1997. The first trial was in 1994. So in 1997, now they're trying to see how several different doses could, help patients. And so they used the results from that first study, and they set up 4 infusions. So the first set of patients only received one. This set of patients is receiving weekly infusions times 4. And they tried, once again, several different concentrations because this is still a phase 1 study, 125, 250, or 375 milligrams per meter squared. So, and now they were looking at 20 patients with low-grade lymphoma, and then 5 patients with intermediate or high-grade relapsed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a tough group to treat. And so what they found from this group of patients, so of the 20 patients, they had 18 that they were able to get the complete data for. 6 patients had a good response, so they call it a partial response, so anywhere between 25 to 50% reduction in tumor bulk. And 5 had minor responses, so around 25% reduction, and 7 had progressive disease. Still, it was, better than 30%, response rate. So the other important result from this study was that 375 milligrams per meter squared, so the highest dose that they tried, was chosen as the dose. And in fact, that's still the dose that patients are getting today when they receive Rituxan. So, and it also showed that the side effects were fairly minor, and that the tumor response, so the reduction in the tumor bulk, occurred not just in the blood, but also in the spleen, in the bone marrow, and in these patients who relapsed after heavy-duty chemotherapy. So these were really important findings. And then the results from this was then used to design the phase 2 trial. So next slide. Okay, and this was now a larger study with more patients. So in this study, they used the same 4 weekly doses of rituximab at the dosage that was determined in the previous trial, and then on 37 patients who had relapsed or were not responsive to previous chemotherapies, and they found clinical remission in 17 patients. So 17 out of 37, that's pretty good. 3 of them had a complete response, meaning the disease disappeared completely. 14 with a partial response, so anywhere between 25 to 50% bulk reduction within 1 to 4 months after treatment. And so that made a response rate of 46%. And some of the responses lasted for more than 20 months. So, and this is with a drug that had very little side effect. It didn't make people lose their hair, didn't make people nauseous. And they determined that the best results were in follicular lymphoma patients with a history of a long remission after prior therapies. And so after the study was published, basically it was fast-tracked also. FDA approved this drug in 1997 for relapsed refractory B-cell lymphomas. So that was pretty fast. And in fact, this study never went on to a phase 3. All these patients never a blinded study. It was always compared to historic studies. So every clinical trial and every drug has a different history, and this one was pretty quick. But just wanted to bring it up that the initial studies were done in a little lab in a dish, and then it was conducted at Stanford. And so I just did a search in clinicaltrial.gov yesterday, and as of yesterday, 407 interventional trials, treatment trials using rituximab. So there was a total of 659 trials that had been completed, 407 for lymphoma, 151 for leukemia, and the rest looked like it was for autoimmune disorders. So now because it takes out B cells, it's being used for autoimmune disease. And the currently open trials, 327, 204 for lymphoma, and 55 for leukemia. So most of these studies are in combination of Rituxan with another drug. Some of them that are already approved for other uses, and others that just came out of their own phase 1 studies. So just want to get the next slide. So this is a kind of a complex diagram, but this is the inside of a cell, and that's the outside of the cell, and this is the inside of what would be a B-cell lymphoma. And all these letters here are some of the newest drugs that are being tested right now, or treatments. And this one here is rituximab. So now we're talking about different combinations you can imagine that are being tested as we speak right now. And for each one of these combinations, a whole trial of anywhere between 15 to several hundred patients need to be done. And so it's actually an exciting time, because I think even 10 years ago, most of these didn't exist. So there's a lot of options out there, and it's exciting times, I think. And so these are all the trials that that are currently open at Stanford. They're not in, I guess these are all the different lymphomas that are being treated in trials at Stanford. I just want to do a little pitch, though, if you can go back one slide. Some of these are molecules that are currently being used in chemotherapy, in treatment of lymphomas. They were never initially discovered as to treat cancer. In fact, ibrutinib was initially just a molecule that was designed to tweak the function, how this molecule works in just basic science of how a B cell, develops. And so that molecule now was taken and was developed into this drug. And so I just want to emphasize that basic research really is very important, that a lot of these targeted cancer therapies, including this one and some of these in here, were never developed as part of cancer therapy, but they've been used. And so that basic research is really important.
Our next speaker, Jack Aiello, was a cancer clinical trial participant on 2 trials and currently serves on Stanford Cancer Institute advisory committees. He's a California Bay Area native with graduate degrees from MIT and a career in various technical sales and marketing positions at local high-tech companies. In 1995, Jack was diagnosed with multiple myeloma. He has been volunteering for many cancer organizations, which include the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, International Myeloma Foundation, Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and as well the local SF Bay Area Myeloma Support Group. Please welcome Jack as our next speaker.
So I'm going to stay seated because I'd rather sit. As was mentioned, I'm a long-time survivor of one of the hematological cancers called multiple myeloma. But I'm here tonight to talk and encourage you to consider clinical trials. I have been through 2 of them. Neither of them worked for me, and yet I'm here to encourage you to consider clinical trials. In myeloma, there have been 10 new drugs approved since 2003, all because folks before you went through clinical trials. There's no cure, but in this particular disease, we look for treatments to extend life and try to manage the cancer for as long as possible. I was in one trial in 1997. It was the end of 97, early 98, for a drug called thalidomide. Thalidomide had been around a long time. It wasn't approved by the FDA, but back in the 50s, it had been developed for to give to pregnant women to help with the anti-nausea effect. And unfortunately, it also caused deformed babies to be born. So it was good that it was never approved in the U.S. But it turns out in 97, it was kind of discovered that it might actually prove useful for combating multiple myeloma. And in fact, I was the 80th patient in a phase 1/2 trial that was still looking at dosages and efficacy. And about a third of those patients responded. That was a big deal. That was the very first targeted therapy for multiple myeloma, which hadn't had any research and new drugs approved ever. So that was a big deal. And while I didn't fall into that third of approval, I was pleased that I was part of that trial and allowed those types of drugs that thalidomide fall into. They're called IMiDs and Revlimid's the better known one these days, and pomalidomide is also used. but they are effective treatments for myeloma. I think the really important thing to realize is that they pay really close attention to you when you're in a trial, not just to see if the drug is effective, but also to see if you're getting any side effects. You might have caught the fact that side effects are measured. They have grade 1 through 4 side effects. And typically, if you're experiencing grade 3 or 4 a side effect, it's a big deal. And it might require changes to be made to doses or frequency of getting a particular treatment. The other thing I was going to mention is, I think it was Asma who said, ask a lot of questions when you're considering going into a trial. Well, you'll almost be forced to ask questions because one of the things you have to sign is an informed consent. And these informed consents are typically 25, 40 pages long. That includes anything and everything you'd like to know about this trial. It's lousy reading, but it's important to go through it and understand it. And it will prompt you to ask questions. And the other thing I want to mention is that there are a lot of trials here, and you saw there are a lot of them for rituximab. The FDA approves the use of a drug for an indication. So it approved rituximab for relapsed refractory patients. But that same trial might have to be run again for newly diagnosed patients. So I always think the best trials to get into are phase 2, where they're looking for efficacy of the drug, or phase 3. You might not get that new drug, but you'll at least get the standard of care. And if it's for newly diagnosed patients, so much the better, because you already know those drugs work for the relapsed refractory patients, which are typically more difficult to treat.
Okay, thank you, Jack, for sharing your story and insights. And now we're going to begin the question and answer portion of this talk. ZUMA-1 trial results in February 2017 are being called the clinical trial results of the year.
I think the results are interesting. It's very personalized medicine, which is interesting because CAR T cells. I think CAR T cells can treat patients with extremely refractive disease in some cases, and I think the patients who are chosen for that are patients who failed multiple lines of therapy, and that's because the treatment is the side effects are not minor. I mean, I think one of the first things that happens is, the patient is hospitalized so that everyone can keep a close eye on them. So I think it's very exciting because at least of the patients that I've seen from our clinics going to CAR T cells, it was either that or transplant or that and transplant right after. So it's one of the last lines of therapy before transplant as an option. But I'm not a physician, so I can't really answer all the exact cases. But those are the cases that I've seen, and I don't think I think the physicians very carefully consider recommending this treatment for patients, partly because I think that the side effects are pretty serious. So I think it's exciting. I think it can cure patients, but I don't think it's not 100%. Nothing is. So, but there are, so I think that the fit for any I think drug one has to weigh the other treatments that's been tried in the past and what has worked or what hasn't worked, and then and every physician considers the options available, and they'll try them in whatever is the most appropriate order as for each patient. So it could be the treatment of the year for some patients, but it might not be something that's considered for other patients.
So the whole idea behind the CAR T cell therapy is to engineer your T cells, which are your immune system, to find a cancer cell. And it finds that cancer cell because that cancer cell apparently, let's say, expresses a CD19 or something like that. So you engineer those CAR T cells to specifically latch on to those cancer cells that express CD19. The problem is that other cells express CD19 as well, so there can be an issue there. But in fact, they are now looking at CAR T and engineering them for other biomarkers on cells. So it's very early in it, and it's very exciting because there have been some patients with ALL that have survived treatment now for 4 years, I think, 4 or 5 years, and it's to be seen. It's a whole new way of looking to make your immune system itself more robust in treating cancer.
Thank you. Next question is, how much do clinical trials cost to the patient?
I can answer that. So it's not one size fits all. Every clinical trial is different. Some of the clinical trials, they might not cover anything at all, something to keep in mind and ask when you're signing or considering to sign the informed consent. Some of the other trials, however, they might cover some portion of your visits, your labs. How we determine that is if it's a routine care, the trial might not cover it, but if we are doing certain procedures or tests to collect data just for the trial, those most likely will be covered by the trial. So as I said before, it's important to ask questions, specifically what is covered, what is not. I don't think we have any trial that covers 100%, correct me if I'm wrong. So there's always some copay or some portion on the participant side that they will see.
Thank you. This is a two-part question. What is an open label trial? And then I'll ask the next one.
So an open label trial which is not blinded. Everybody will get the assigned medication. It most likely will not be a randomized trial. So basically open label means we know what we are giving to the participant. Everybody knows, the participant knows what they are getting, the physician knows what they are getting. So there is no placebo involved in an open label trial.
Thank you. Next one, when will a trial change course, effective versus not effective?
Most of the trials these days, they have what we call an interim analysis. That is determined before we start the clinical trial. For example, let's say a trial is looking to enroll 50 patients. The researchers, based on the statistics, they might say, okay, when we enroll 20 patients, we want to look at the data and see, is the medication working or not? And they have their own data points which they want to look at. When the trial enrolls 20 patients, they'll go and analyze that data, and all that they will say is, yes, the drug is effective, the trial should go on. However, there have been cases where they have seen, no, the drug is not effective or it's causing more side effects, and they will stop the trial, and that has happened. And that is the purpose of that interim analysis. So very good question.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Can I make one point?
Sure.
You might wonder how the trials come about. So pharmaceutical companies might initiate a trial, especially a phase 1 trial. An institution like Stanford might decide to and want to initiate a particular trial. There is also NCTN, which is the National Clinical Trial Network in the US. And it has several large groups of institutions. And because for phase 2 or phase 3, where you may need 1,000 or more patients, a single institution can't do that. So then it gets opened up to multiple institutions, let's say through, I'm going to say SWOG. SWOG happens to be one of these groups that has 600 institutions that belong to it. Or ECOG is another one, or Alliance is another one. It doesn't really matter what the names are. But they're all within the National Clinical Trials Network. I think one of the things you'd find interesting is that when trials get proposed, let's say by Stanford, or an institution that wants Stanford to to do this trial, that trial has to go through several committees. And one of the committees it goes through is a scientific review committee, which consists of doctors and nurses and some patients like myself that look at the trial from a scientific standpoint. Does it ask and answer, try to answer a good question? A statistical standpoint, does it accrue enough? Does it try to accrue enough patients to answer statistically what it's trying to answer? And resource-wise, does Stanford have enough people to run this trial? These organizations called SWOG and Alliance and ECOG also have these committees for particular diseases that look at trials. Those trials, if they get through that particular committee, then it goes up to National Cancer Institute. The National Cancer Institute also has patient representatives on those committees to examine those trials and offer information from a patient perspective. So I always think, and I didn't know this, but I now know it, that patients are pretty well represented in not only in obviously being the people participating in this trial, but also in helping with the development of this trial. Whether it makes sense to ask a patient to do a 24-hour urine analysis twice a week, probably not, but there I've seen trials that propose this, or whether, whatever it is, what the eligibility criteria for trials are and such, patients often have a voice in determining whether it makes sense for that trial to look like it should look, or should it be changed before it really gets approved.
Got more questions here. Is there a list of requirements/symptoms a patient should comply in order to be part of a specific trial?
When you are considering, or your oncologist wants you to enroll in a trial or recommends a trial, every trial has an eligibility criteria. The purpose of the eligibility criteria is not to single out patients. It's all for safety purposes. We want to make sure we have the right patient population who the drug will work on. We do not want to have anyone that doesn't meet that eligibility criteria, those signs and symptoms. For example, in CLL, patients usually need to have some symptoms to meet the treatment criteria, to meet the eligibility criteria. And the reason is we're not trying to single them out or not to have them not enroll in the trial, but we are making sure they are the right candidate for the medication. Hopefully that answers the question. And the second part, what happens once participants enroll in the clinical trial? Every visit they come, even if they are not coming, depends on what the study is requiring us. We ask them any side effect, anything out of the ordinary that they did not see before they were taking the medication. It can be something as simple as headaches, to something going to the doctor. We need to know everything so that we can keep a close eye and see if there's a pattern with other patients. Because a single patient, they might not be aware this is related to the medication, but when we see collective data, it is important for us to know what is happening to make the determination if the medication is safe or not.
Why do some patients respond well to certain medicines and other patients do not? Is it something in the individual blood cancer or something in the individual patient, or is it?
That's some of the things that they're actually trying to figure out with these clinical trials themselves. I mean, the doctors themselves want to know so that they can predict perhaps in the future what treatments to recommend to certain people. So they themselves don't know for a lot of the treatments. I mean, for some of the specific antibody treatments, maybe the cell doesn't express, doesn't have the little antenna on the surface that the drug targets. And now for a lot of these trials, they're actually pre-testing the cancers to see if that target exists or not. But in other cases, they have no idea. So they're looking at everything from the genome of the cancers, or perhaps the genome, the baseline genome of the patient themselves, to see if there's any characteristic. that can predetermine. And so in the future, perhaps they can narrow down, oh, this 30% of the patients could get this drug, and oh, for these patients, we can recommend this drug. And so it's still an ongoing process. It's really exciting right now.
Use some information and resources. First, how can you find cancer clinical trials at Stanford? You can visit the cancer.stanford.edu/trials website and conduct keyword searches and browse conditions and eligibility flowcharts. You can download the Stanford Cancer Clinical Trials Search app, available for free on iTunes and Google Play. And you can contact the Stanford Cancer Clinical Trials Information Service. For studies available at other institutions, you can find information from the National Institutes of Health at clinicaltrials.gov, the National Cancer Institute at cancer.gov, and from a Leukemia and Lymphoma Society information specialist who can conduct individual clinical trial searches for you. If you have a general inquiry about cancer clinical trials available at Stanford, an information specialist can help you identify trials available, provide you with a study contact for the clinical trial, provide you with a new patient coordinator contact, explain what to expect if you would like to enroll in a study, and send you information related to the inquiry via email or postal mail. For assistance with general resources for your cancer information search, we'd also like to suggest the Stanford Health Library, where you can get help from a health librarian at 4 locations. They provide free customized literature searches for your medical or health-related questions, and I believe there's a health library location here in this building. Also, the National Cancer Institute has a cancer information specialist who can help you with a variety of your cancer-related questions, including assisting with clinical trial searches. Services are free and anonymous. Lastly, the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society information specialists can assist you through cancer treatment, financial, and social challenges, and give accurate, up-to-date information on disease, treatment, and social support. If you're interested in receiving Stanford Cancer Clinical Trials event notifications, consider subscribing to our email list. And you can subscribe online at cancer.stanford.edu/trials. And on the website, look for subscribe to our events, which is underneath need help finding a trial. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Asma, Ami, Jack, and all of you for being here, for being a part of Stanford Clinical Trials Awareness Month. And we look forward to your joining us again at our future events.
The preceding program is copyrighted by the Board of Trustees of the Leland Stanford Junior University. Please visit us at med.stanford.edu.